I know there is lots of actual religious connotation to it.
So is it true that you actually went to Banaras for that and sat down with Aghoris?
I wonder which is older, the European vampire or Indian Rakshas.
Was there any part of your early childhood that had some influence of Lord of the Rings, Ramayana, Mahabharata?
Bhai, paisa banana hai?
Similar to all of us, a brown guy in the West.
Today, corporate drama is horror.
बिशन है क्या, वो विभीषण है क्या?
I'm going to write the next Lord of the Rings.
Hello, friends. This is Indra and welcome to another episode of NRI Studios podcast. Joining with me today are my dear friends Vivek, Anshu, Prasanjit, Amit, and Vishwajit. It gives me a joy to welcome our guest today. We are a huge fan of his work, and I'm pretty sure he does not need any additional introduction from us. Everyone, please welcome Ram Narayanan Venkateshan Iyer, the great Ramvi. Ram, welcome to our show.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for
Welcome.
having me.
Welcome.
How are you doing today, Ram?
Yeah, good. It's I'm in London, so it's a gloomy gray day, but at least it's not raining, so that's about as good as it gets.
Yes.
And thank you, Ram, so much for your time and being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So usually we will start with just an initial question or intro. So I will start just first, and then my friends will just go ahead. So my first question, Ram, let's say, it has always kind of intrigued me. This guy from India who studied chemical engineering, then worked as a chemical engineer, and then he suddenly goes into the space of writing and storytelling via comics and graphic novel. So could you tell us, Ram, how did this transformation happen and how this journey was?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it wasn't really a transformation. I'd always been writing, even when I was a kid. I think the first memory I have of writing is when I was 13. I read Lord of the Rings, and immediately I was like, I'm going to write the next Lord of the Rings. And as a 13-year-old, I sat down and just started writing a little bit of story every day, and I wrote about 45,000 words of a story, which for someone who is barely a teenager I look back at it now and I go like, that's a significant achievement for someone, because that's the length of a small novella.
Yeah.
And I think the more I have written professionally, the more I appreciate the ability to just sit down and write something of that length. So I had it in me when I was a kid. Obviously, my parents thought it was cute, but they said, "Bhai, paisa banana hai, chemical engineer ban jao." So I started. I studied chemical engineering. I did my bachelor's in India. I did a master's in material science at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was during my time there that I started realizing that, I can learn anything I want. I can pursue anything I want. Because the education system there, especially at an Ivy League university like Penn, was very encouraging of me going in different directions, wanting to learn other things. So I did, as extracurricular activity, I took film appreciation courses. I did jazz appreciation. I took English literature over there as well. And so by the time I was finished with my engineering, I was already about halfway to not doing any engineering. So I worked as a chemical engineer for a while, and then 2013 came around, and I don't know, I had this moment of looking back and going, do I want to be 60? And going, I wish I had done the other thing, because that's what I really loved. So I quit and I started writing. I had a few things already published by then, so I knew I wasn't some Dunning-Kruger fool going into writing, going like, I bet I'm good, and turns out I'm not. No. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started. And I did a book called Aghori in India for an Indian publisher called Holy Cow. And that was, I think that was my first book that made me feel like I know what I'm doing, because I think there were a lot of people who didn't expect such a book to exist in the Indian market, and suddenly it was there, and that response was really encouraging for me. And I moved to the UK to study creative writing after that. I think I moved in 2014. And then by 2016, I self-published a book called Black Mumba, with a bunch of the artists that I had met in the Indian comics industry. And then that book kind of opened the door for me to work with a lot of other American publishers, because they found out that telling stories about Mumbai and India can also sell. So
So, yeah, go ahead, Amit.
Yeah, I sorry to cut you, Mr. Dada. He was supposed to ask, but on Black Mumba, one of my friend Arindam saying, actually shout out to him. He, he was the one who told us that you can invite Ramvi also. He generally goes to the podcast, so we are really happy that you joined. So his question was how and when the Black Mumba 2 is coming out then, or is there any plans for that?
I don't know, to be honest. Like, I'm in a place where people keep asking me when is the part 2 for a lot of books. Like, people are like, where's D7 Shores? Where's part 2 of Laila Star? And I don't know, there's some romance to doing one thing well once and then not doing it again. Because I feel like I'm convinced there are no good trilogies. None that exist in pop culture anywhere. I think Lord of the Rings comes close, but I can't think of one more trilogy that had all 3 good. So I'm being safe. I'm just doing one rather than.
तो हिंदी में बोलते हैं ना, अधूरा प्रेम is the best love, kind of a thing, like.
और I think also philosophically मेरी disagreement ये है कि एक चीज अगर अच्छी है उसको बार बार करो फिर मजा चले जाता है, जो वो एक चीज जो अच्छी थी वो भी पुरानी लगने लगती है.
Diminishing returns हो जाता है.
I think in film the one closest that I can think that comes in a trilogy is Chris Nolan's Batman. Maybe. I mean,
yeah, but even in that, the third part is much exactly. You see what I mean? Like, I mean, you take Godfather, right? That's probably the most famous trilogy in films to exist, and even there, the third movie is like, eh.
So
yeah, Dada, go on. Sorry,
go ahead.
So since you asked, I mean, I had another question in mind about a particular story, but I just wanted to ask, like, since you have, going back to your roots, have been thinking that you are a storyteller and want to be a storyteller. There are various formats of storytelling, right? I mean, being a storyteller, what made you choose comics, or graphic novels, or whatever we call it, like that as the medium of your storytelling? Like, one thing is that I want to be a writer. I know I can tell stories. The second is learning the craft of comics or modern graphic novels.
Yeah, and I think you already hit on the answer. Like, I don't think I intended to write comics per se. My interest is in storytelling wherever they will let me tell stories. So when I started out, I was writing prose. My first published work is actually a prose short story. I only got into comics because my cousin, who was studying to be a filmmaker in India at the time, said, like, your writing style is very visual. So have you tried writing for comics? And I had already read a bunch of comics by then. I'd fallen in love with the Vertigo comics from late 80s, mid 90s-ish. And my brain just went, oh, yeah, why haven't I tried writing comics? And I went, I wonder how comics are written. So my first instinct was to find my copy of Arkham Asylum and look at Morrison's scripts in the back. And then I went, okay, let me see if I can find some more scripts. And so I think you have answered the question when you say they are two very distinct things, like knowing how to tell a story and then knowing how to use a medium to tell it. And fortunately for someone like me who has been to university twice as long as most other people I know, I love just learning things. So I think last year was my first year writing something for a video game. So I've written for a video game now. I've also done some work in animation. I've done some work for film and TV as well. So my aim is to write in as many mediums as I can.
Okay.
I have one. Sorry, Dada, I just want to interject. So, Ram, when you went into UPenn, the courses that you took, they were single credit course, 3 credit course. Were you on a scholarship? How did you manage that extra expenditure on your learnings at
That
UPenn?
extra expenditure was my part of it was scholarship. The other part was my father's expectation that I will become a chemical engineer like him. So it was a giant waste of his money, but
But it was a 0 credit or a single credit or 3 credits? How does
no,
or no credit?
I think it was 3 credits. I think it was 15 credits a year or something like that.
Mhm.
So you had to take, I don't remember the exact system now, but you had to take a bunch of, I think you had to take like 5 course subjects, and they were 3 credits each, so 15 credits every year.
So, yeah, that's what I was interested in because I also did a master's here, and I know, right? Like after a threshold, you can get other things for free, but
Yeah.
still you have to meet that threshold for.
Yeah. So no, I was very much. I did very well studying chemical engineering, and then beyond that, I was insane, and I had time, and I had friends who were encouraging of my insanity. So I would go sit in on all of these other courses.
That was like that shows like how workaholic you may have been, even
See,
when
I
you
mean,
left.
none of those things felt like work. I think that was the biggest
Okay, yeah.
difference with me. Like when I was young, my I was talking about this with someone else today. My parents, my mother is a very big sort of music person, music fan, and very classical Indian classical music. So I learned Carnatic vocals, I learned veena, I learned tabla, I learned violin when I was a kid, and I hated learning all of them because none of them were things I wanted to learn. I mean, I learned them well, and I'm very now as an adult, I'm very thankful that I know all of those things. But I think I was 16 and I said I want to learn guitar, and my mom was very very disappointed because she was like, यार इतना क्लासिकल म्यूजिक सिखाया और ये अभी गिटार बजाने चले जा रहा है. And I remember the first time feeling like I had ownership of something I was learning. And I remember I used to play till 3, 4, 5 in the morning. No one would have to tell me to practice, have to tell me to sit down. And I think largely I realized that if everything I do feels like play and not work, then it's quite exciting to be doing that work. It's quite exciting to be involved in that process.
Yeah. Back to you, Dada.
All right. So obviously, I want to dig in a little bit into your work. So of course, I want to talk about first thing is Swamp Thing, because Swamp Thing for me is like one of the most iconic. Why for me? For everybody, like it's one of the most iconic comics written, and with the everybody that has explored, I guess they have read Alan Moore's run on it, right? And it establishes the character in a very different way. So once you read the anatomy lesson and you get to know, I mean, it's a whole different character. But when you reinvented this character, and I like, of course, that you reinvented it with a character from Indian origins, similar to all of us, a brown guy in the West, like you said. So I want to know what made it a conscious decision that when you reinvent this character, you reinvent it with the roots of Indian origin. Plus, also, there are certain things like which are very different in this Swamp Thing from what it was previously. Like, I mean, Alec Holland's character of the Swamp Thing is like he's a man who dies off, and like the swamp sort of takes his consciousness, and then it stays as is, like it is Swamp Thing. And the character that we read, I mean, it could be like spoiler, no spoiler. Like now, it has been, I think, more than 2 years we have this book.
Yeah,
And
I think we're safe to give out spoilers at this point.
yeah, so the lead character here, Levi Kami, he kind of hops in and out of the Swamp Thing avatar, and
Yeah.
it's different from what it was. Obviously, the elements of Indian origins are so finely meshed with this character once you finish the arc that it comes to you that this probably is the thing that it should have been ultimately. And the whole vegetation around the world, you have woven that completely into the character's background. So I want to know about all these things, like what was your thought process while reinventing this character, how the Indian origin thing came into being, and all these things.
Yeah, I mean, there were, I think, predominantly two concerns. One is DC told me very early on that Swamp Thing books don't sell. And they said, we haven't sold this book well since Alan Moore wrote it. So be warned that you're taking on a character that doesn't sell well, right? And that set my brain thinking, like, why not? I mean, Alan Moore did such a wonderful job on that run. He created such a wonderful story. Why is it that iteration of Swamp Thing doesn't work anymore? And I realized that everyone's telling the same story eventually. Like, you can do lots of different things with it, but it would always come down to Alec Holland and Anton Arcane and the same relationships and the same. And at that point, you're devolving something into soap opera. Whereas I think Alan Moore's run was more interested in the bigger ideas of what Swamp Thing can be. And I think in order for those bigger ideas to be free, they had to be free of the sort of same human drama that had been seen for all those years. So I said, there was already history. I think in one of the one shots that Neil Gaiman did for the character, he had already insinuated that there were many versions of Swamp Thing. So I said, well, why can't we do a new version of Swamp Thing that isn't Alec Holland? Also, I felt like the way to make that book relatable to people reading it now was to make it about someone who is from now. And Alec Holland is from the 1980s, and he's always been from the 1980s. He doesn't understand what it's like to be overtaken by post-capitalism politics. He doesn't understand colonial exploitation and the aftermath of that. And I felt like those were topics that were pertinent when we were talking about vegetation and swamp and green things in the world. And so I picked a character that I felt I knew and I could understand. I think there was also the thematic concern of wanting a character who, like you mentioned, Moore's character was the swamp taking human consciousness. And so almost was the swamp trying to understand humanity in some way. And I wanted to do the opposite of that. I wanted to, in 2024, have a human character try and understand why the swamp is important and why the world is important, and why it's meaningful to be part of something bigger than yourself. Because I think in 2024, individual solipsism and isolation is a interesting story to tell. Like, we are better connected than we were before, and yet I think we are individually each more isolated than we were before in a lot of ways. And this idea of technological connection versus cultural, historical, planetary connection, they're interesting things to put next to each other and examine. And so I put my experience in it. I'm an Indian immigrant. I love technology, but I also love where I come from. I love modern day sci-fi Star Wars stories, but I also love stories that my grandmother used to tell me. And so in trying to reconcile those differences, I think that's where the character came from.
it's actually interesting because when you said, you wanted to know which, like what origin to base it from, to find the premise and then base the character on. I remember an interview in which Alan Moore said when he was given the character that which swamp is the thing from, because it was important from the perspective to base, if you have to develop a human consciousness into a monster, you need to know where the human is from, what was the premise of the
Yeah.
thing is. So when you took
Because inherently, I think every
Yeah.
human has the capacity for monstrousness within them, and
right
depending on where you're from, that manifests in different ways.
right so that's why, like, when you said like he knows the things of the Indian origin and the corporate thing and all, Alec Holland didn't knew all those things. I think the character was a lot based out on airy and horrorish things in this 80s genre, whereas the Swamp Thing that we read today is more of a corporate drama woven into the whole character's history taken with it. So that's
Yeah,
a
but
very
I think today corporate drama is horror. So
yes. So that's the modern horror.
yeah, I think the things that we worry about and the things that scare us change with time.
Yeah.
And I think the things that people worried about in the 1980s were very different from the things that people
Yes.
worry about now. So
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Indrashish, next question.
No, I think Vivek, I think you were waiting. You wanted to ask something to Ram. Go ahead, Vivek.
So yeah, first of all, thank you for joining on this podcast, Ram. So we know
Pleasure.
that you are a busy writer, and we appreciate you taking time for us. So there are so many things that I want to talk about now, more than the question that I had, because we know how you grew up watching Lord of the Rings. What's your mental take on taking any of the characters or any of the story until and unless it's needed, as we were talking with Biswajit, Dada, and you about the seriousness of demonic nature, or So my question, I would take you from Swamp Thing to the ancient and modern Indian history. I was completely blown away with this book, These Savage Shores. I don't know how many of us, we all have read this book, but I don't know from the audience perspective how many of them have read this book. And
sure.
And I would encourage all of them to read this, because it's a different take of how British East India Company came to India, what they had in their arsenal, and how they didn't imagine that there would be an equivalent blow given by an Indian demon. We talk about in this book mainly about various different things, from demons to Rakshas, to vampires and everything. And there is a symbolic nature hidden if we deep dive into it. That's the beauty of your writing. And lately, I had been reading, I haven't yet finished the book, but I was also blown away by the take that you have taken on the Vigil. The Vigil that I think it came out last year.
Yeah.
It's a fresh take on superheroes who are actually not superheroes, but metahumans in a sense. And they are working in a geopolitical hotspot of how India is being placed amongst the Western world. And because we see some narrative of different established companies like LexCorp, you have hinted LexCorp and some other, so it's interesting, like how all these companies are weaponizing the technology and turning it for their own evil will. And these metahumans are going in there they are having their own kind of problems, but they are still trying to do the right thing. So my question to you is, like, when I compare These Savage Shores and The Vigil, they both are set in two different times. One is set in ancient history, and talks about modern Indian history, as well as this one is talking about more of a geopolitical scenario that's happening today or may happen in future. So as a writer, was there any part of your early childhood that had some influence of Lord of the Rings, Ramayana, Mahabharata running in back of your mind? And how aware as a writer you have to be to write or come up with these stories with an awareness of world history and current political events?
I mean, I'll answer them as separate questions. I think in terms of how much influence there is from the stories that we've all grown up with, I think that's where anything meaningful comes from for a writer. It has to come from some sort of personal experience, some sort of personal connection. So These Savage Shores came about because I had just finished watching Coppola's Dracula, and just one corner of my brain went like, I wonder which is older, the European vampire or Indian Rakshas. Because if you think about the Rakshas as a very basic definition, they're the same. They come out only at night, they hang out in forests, they capture unsuspecting travelers, and they drink their blood. And the vampires are kind of defined very much the same way. And I realized that the Rakshas is actually mentioned in Indian mythology 200 years before the first mention of a vampire. And that got my brain thinking, like, what does someone who has lived 200 years more than any other vampire think of them, think of humanity? And also, the Rakshas is very much a creature of Indian mythology. And in Indian mythology, having grown up in South India, we're always told that, Ravan's a bad guy in Ramayana, but he was also a good guy in a lot of ways, in that he was a scholar, he loved the arts, he was devoted to his prayer of his gods, and they gave him lots of boons, and he was a well-respected king even in Lanka, right? And this idea that you're allowed to be both good and bad, and there's no way to separate the two things and make you only a villain or make you only a good guy. I thought that was very interesting. Whereas the vampire is essentially a creation of sort of the Christianity's need to see their good guys and bad guys as black and white. So the vampire necessarily is an evil creation, and it looks at human beings as lesser than itself. Whereas technically, if you place them along the same timeline, Rakshasas gave up their world for regular human beings, and they did not see human beings as lesser than themselves, which presented me with a very interesting take, because that, to me, is the difference between what colonialism does to a place and what having a place's indigenous culture evolve does to a place. Colonialism thinks of the place as inferior to itself, and so it tries to change the place. Whereas the indigenous cultures and myths, they try to see the place as an evolution of themselves. And I think that's where the fundamental sort of thematic argument of These Savage Shores comes from. In terms of historic events, I think once I started thinking of colonial history and all of that, the Anglo-Mysore Wars were a good place for me to place all of this. Also because I think the Sultan of Mysore was pretty badass, even in his time, even post-colonialism. Do you guys know the story of the Rolls Royces in the Mysore Palace?
Yeah.
So I had read that. I had read that story somewhere, and I thought, man, that is such a badass move to pull, because the assumption is that, oh, you're from India, you must be uncivilized, you must be a savage, and for this guy to go like, okay, I'm gonna buy 100 of your cars and give it to my servants. I thought that was interesting. I think that's where this whole idea of presenting India in that era, in the 1700s, as a place where, like, the Europeans had still not figured out how to take baths, and the Indians were already 25% of the world economy at that point in time. So I don't think people understand how much colonialism changes and destroys a place. So yeah, that was my motivation there. And then with the Vigil, it was born largely out of a reaction to this idea that any story, because the reason the Vigil came up is because one of my DC editors, Jessica Chen, said we want to do a line of books that are Asian characters in the lead, and we want you, because you've done so well with other Asian characters in books, we want you to write this. And I think the expectation was, I go, yeah, sure, Indian characters, I'll give you some mythology, I'll give you some gods. And I was like, and not to be critical of anybody else's work, but all of the other books in that lineup were doing similar things. Like, I'm gonna base it off of Chinese mythology or Korean mythology. And I went like, why always mythology? I just want to do a story with Indian characters that has nothing to do with their past and everything to do with their future. And I said, contemporary India has some very interesting stories to tell, is a huge market, is a huge player on a geopolitical level. Everything India does matters worldwide. And to put ourselves in that position and then go, but should we be part of this system? Should we propagate this idea that everything must be exploited and mined and weaponized and sort of sacrificed at the altar of making profit? I think that's where the Vigil is born out of. And I wanted to do superheroes that were flawed and messy people and had problems, and sometimes you couldn't quite tell if this was a good person or a bad person, because those are the kinds of stories that I love. And I think I always have this argument with people in India and with people in America, and I say superheroes are the last modern mythology. I don't think of this age, if you look at the great sort of Greco-Roman mythology, Hindu mythology, Persian mythology, I think superheroes are this era's mythology. And the great problem of why mythologies don't survive is because people find them and then they say, no, this is too much gray. If we turn this into black and white, and if we say this is good, this is bad, then I can print that in a book, I can turn it into a religion, and I can make lots of money. So all great mythologies get turned into religion, and they die because of it. And I think superheroes are also heading down that way in a lot of ways. The reason you can't tell certain kinds of stories with them now is because, oh my God, what will the kids think? We put them on tiffin boxes. But these all used to be terrible, messy characters. And so because I was creating these characters from scratch, they were not on anyone's tiffin boxes, and I never had to make sure that they were all nice guys. So it was an opportunity to do that. Also from a very Indian perspective. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I think they will make that also a religion once it gets famous. That has been the case, right?
I mean, it already is. Like, if you see the way some Star Wars fans talk about their characters online, then you're like, what's the difference between you and someone who says, oh, you can't show Christ this way, this is wrong, it's bad, you know?
Yeah. And since you mentioned about Vivek Bhai mentioned about these 7 shows, we all loved that book. We had a 1-hour podcast on that also. तो उसमें एक सवाल है कि जो बिशन है, क्या वो विभीषण है क्या? ये कैन यू कंफर्म, या फिर इसको आप ओपन टू इंटरप्रिटेशन?
I think the beauty of Bishan is
I was
वो
just
है
about
कौन
to
किसी
ask
को
that
पता नहीं, वो है कौन किसी को पता नहीं. But obviously there is a Vibhishan connection from his name, but also from one of his origin stories that he tells, where he betrayed his brother to stand
Yes.
with the best of men. So
Exactly.
yeah, there is a connection there, and I thought that was lovely because per Hindu mythology, Vibhishan is supposed to be one of the Chiranjeev immortals who is still on Earth, kind of thing. So I
Mhm.
felt like that was a nice thread to pull on. But I like the idea that Bishan is whoever you want
You
him
want
to
to,
be.
yeah, yeah. And then
Yeah.
my next question is on this book. Actually, I loved this book, Many Deaths of Laila Star.
Thank you.
तो
Yeah.
व्हेन आई स्टार्टेड रीडिंग दिस आई थॉट कि ये कोई फैंटेसी बुक होगी जिसमें इंडियन गॉड्स के बारे में थोड़ा उससे रिलेटेड कुछ स्टोरी होगी. बट जैसे जैसे मैं स्टोरी पढ़ता गया इट फेल्ट लाइक यू आर राइटिंग अ पोएम. ओके, एंड देन व्हेन दैट सिगरेट सीक्वेंस कम्स इन ना, तो वो सिगरेट के थ्रू जो आपने 7-8 पेजेस में बताया है दैट एक्सप्लेन्स द होल बुक एक्चुअली. वो डेथ से लेकर बर्थ से लेकर डेथ का जो पूरा सीक्वेंस है उसमें, और सिगरेट इज टॉकिंग टू मी. एंड आई फेल्ट लाइक मैं मतलब मैंने ज्यादा पोएम्स नहीं पढ़ी है, बट इन स्कूल टाइम्स वी यूज्ड टू हैव सम हिंदी कविज जो ऐसे ही किसी फूल से बात करते हैं या फिर किसी इनएनिमेटेड ऑब्जेक्ट से बात करते हैं, एंड देन दे एक्चुअली वो आपसे बात कर रहे हैं एंड एक्सप्लेनिंग यू दैट थिंग. तो
Sure.
आर यू ऑल्सो लाइक इनटू पोएट्री, एंड इफ यस देन मतलब उसका कुछ कनेक्शन है आपका तो उसके बारे में बताइए थोड़ा.
I mean, I'm into poetry in as much as I look at it and go like, I have no idea how to do this. And
Okay.
it's very important to have things like that because I've been writing for a few years now, and every time I look at another writer's work, part of me is reading the story, but there's also part of me that's like, I wouldn't have done it this way, or I would have done it this way. Poetry is still one of those pieces of writing that I can look at and go like, this is still entirely foreign to me, and so I'm mesmerized by it. Um, I don't read a lot of poetry. But I read enough of it for me to be inspired by it, if you will. I don't think I necessarily framed Leila like a poem, although the last issue has a bit of poetry in it,
Yes.
which was written entirely as a way to make fun of Rupi Kaur, but people seem to enjoy it. And then, yeah, I mean, the cigarette issue came about because a long time ago, I had an idea for a short story about a cigarette that's left burning in an ashtray while two people, their relationship, like a boyfriend girlfriend, are breaking up in front of the cigarette, and they're two teenagers. So for them, breakup is like, ठीक है यार, 2 साल में और कोई मिल जाएगा and it'll be fine. But for the cigarette, it is the most important thing because
Yes.
मैं अभी मरने वाला हूँ और 2 मिनट में my life will be dead, and this is the only relationship I get to see in front of me. So I had an idea to do a story like that, which I never got around to writing. But then this issue came along, this book came along. I was like, I think I can do it here. And what better way to do it than talk about death, than talk about something that lives and dies within a few minutes.
And on the follow-up question is जो लाइला का कैरेक्टर है, it reincarnates every like some number मैंने लिखे हैं like 8 years, 12 years, 16 and then 28. So I was trying to find if there is any logic to it, or is it just random you have picked it up?
No, I think the only logic was to make her be present at the stages of Darius's life that felt like they were pivotal stages. I know there is lots of actual religious connotation to it, but essentially I just wanted her there when he was born, when he was a kid, when he was an adolescent, when he was an
Yes.
adult, and when he was an old man. So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was the only logic behind it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Anshul Bhai, go on.
Thanks a lot, Ram, for coming over for our podcast.
My pleasure.
Like all of us, I'm a big fan of all your work, especially these savage shows and Aghori. So with these savage shows, I have a funny incident. I was carrying it in my backpack in my office, and one of my office colleague, he said, "Which book are you reading?" I said, "These savage shows." Means he was basically into DC Marvel, and I said, "Go ahead, give a try." And when he read it, he said it's mind blowing. So my question basically is to your first book, which again is a mind-blowing book, Aghori.
Hmm.
So we had Vivek Goel on a podcast, and he basically told that when you approach him, you had the whole story of Aghori ready, and for the whole phase where Vikram Roy goes and transforms into the Aghori, right? That whole cycle is one of the most interesting piece that I have read in recent times. The whole cycle of whole chakra of him turning into the Aghori.
Hmm.
So is it true that you actually went to Banaras for that and sat down with Aghoris?
Let's start at 1, 2, 3. Go.
Okay.